In a world where assumptions can be deadly and first impressions often last forever, one moment of judgment would change everything. Picture this: a crowded military briefing room filled with decorated officers, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. At the center of it all stands a colonel, his chest heavy with medals, his voice booming with authority. Across from him, a quiet woman in civilian clothes, her presence barely noticed by the room full of military brass. What happens next would shatter every preconceived notion about strength, experience, and what it truly means to serve your country. Because sometimes, the most dangerous person in the room is the one nobody sees coming. And sometimes, 20 years of elite training speaks louder than any uniform ever could. This is the story of Sarah Mitchell, and the day she reminded everyone that heroes don't always look the way we expect them to. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her position in the uncomfortable metal chair, her eyes scanning the room with the practiced ease of someone who had spent 2 decades reading situations before they turned dangerous. The Pentagon briefing room buzzed with conversation between military personnel, their uniforms crisp and their medals catching the harsh fluorescent light. She was the only civilian in the room, wearing a simple grey blazer and black pants, her brown hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. To everyone else, she looked like just another government contractor, maybe an analyst or a secretary taking notes. That was exactly how she preferred it. The mission briefing had been called for Operation Silent Thunder, a high-stakes rescue operation in hostile territory. Intelligence suggested that 3 American journalists had been captured by a militant group operating in the mountains of Afghanistan. Time was running out, and the window for extraction was closing fast. Sarah had been brought in as a consultant, though the exact nature of her expertise hadn't been shared with most of the room. Colonel James Harrison stood at the front of the room, his imposing figure commanding attention as he outlined the tactical approach. He was old-school military, the kind of officer who believed in hierarchy, protocol, and the idea that combat was a man's domain. His steel-grey eyes swept across the room as he spoke, lingering dismissively on Sarah before moving on to the uniformed personnel he considered his real audience. The plan he presented was textbook military strategy, but Sarah could see the flaws immediately. The proposed entry point was too obvious, the extraction route too linear, and the contingency plans too rigid for the fluid nature of mountain warfare. She had operated in similar terrain countless times during her years with SEAL Team 6, though nobody in this room knew that. Her service record was classified at the highest levels, and she preferred to keep her past achievements out of civilian conversations. As Colonel Harrison concluded his presentation, he opened the floor for questions and input. Several officers chimed in with minor tactical suggestions, but nothing that addressed the fundamental weaknesses Sarah had identified. She waited, hoping someone else would spot the issues. But as the discussion continued, it became clear that the plan would proceed as outlined, unless she spoke up. Sarah raised her hand quietly. "Excuse me, Colonel. I have a few concerns about the proposed approach." The conversation in the room died instantly. Colonel Harrison's expression hardened as he turned to face her, his irritation barely concealed. "Ms. Mitchell, isn't it? I appreciate your interest, but this is a military operation being planned by military professionals. Perhaps you could save your observations for the administrative briefing later." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. Several officers in the room chuckled softly, and Sarah felt the familiar burn of being underestimated. It was a feeling she had grown accustomed to during her early years in the Navy, when she had to fight twice as hard as her male counterparts to earn respect and recognition. But those days had taught her patience, and patience had kept her alive through missions that would have broken lesser operators. "With respect, Colonel, I believe my concerns are relevant to the tactical success of this operation," Sarah replied calmly, her voice steady despite the dismissive atmosphere in the room. Colonel Harrison's face reddened slightly. "Ma'am, I've been planning military operations since before you were probably even born. This isn't a conference room debate or academic exercise. This is about real soldiers going into harm's way, and I won't have civilians second-guessing strategies developed by trained combat veterans." The irony of his statement wasn't lost on Sarah. During her 20 years as a Navy SEAL, she had planned and executed more high-risk operations than most of the officers in this room combined. She had been the first woman to complete SEAL training after the military quietly opened the program to female candidates in 2018, though her achievement had been kept classified for operational security reasons. Her record included successful missions in Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Somalia, and a dozen other locations that didn't officially exist on any map. But sitting in that briefing room, dressed in civilian clothes, and surrounded by skeptical faces, she was just another contractor who didn't know her place. Sarah had retired from active duty 3 years earlier, after a mission in Syria had gone sideways and left her with a shattered left shoulder and post-traumatic stress that she was still learning to manage. The transition to civilian life had been more difficult than any combat operation she had ever undertaken. The structure and purpose that had defined her adult life had disappeared overnight, leaving her feeling lost and disconnected from the world around her. She had tried working for defense contractors but found the corporate culture stifling and the work unfulfilling. She had attempted to return to school, enrolling in a graduate program in international relations, but the academic environment felt artificial compared to the life and death realities she was used to navigating. For 2 years, she had drifted, taking occasional consulting jobs and struggling with the question that haunted many veterans. What do you do when the only thing you were ever truly good at becomes something you can no longer do? The call to consult on Operation Silent Thunder had come through General Patricia Williams, one of the few people who knew the full extent of Sarah's military background. General Williams had been the one to recommend Sarah for SEAL training, recognizing her potential even when others doubted whether a woman could handle the physical and mental demands of the program. She had also been the one to visit Sarah in the hospital after the Syria mission, holding her hand as the doctors explained that her shoulder would never be strong enough for active combat again. "Sarah," General Williams had said during the phone call 3 days earlier, "I have a situation that requires someone with your particular expertise. I can't give you details over the phone, but I need someone who understands mountain warfare and unconventional tactics. Someone who won't be intimidated by a room full of traditional thinking." Sarah had accepted the assignment without hesitation, grateful for the chance to feel useful again. But now, sitting in the Pentagon briefing room and feeling the weight of Colonel Harrison's dismissal, she wondered if she had made a mistake. Maybe it was time to accept that her military career was truly over and that her opinions no longer carried the weight they once had. But then she thought about the 3 journalists somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan, probably terrified, and depending on the people in this room to bring them home safely. She thought about the soldiers who would be sent on this mission, young men and women who deserved the best possible plan, not just the most convenient one. And she thought about the 20 years of training and experience that had taught her to speak up when lives were on the line, regardless of the personal cost. Sarah stood up slowly, her movement deliberate and controlled. The room fell completely silent as all eyes turned to her. Colonel Harrison crossed his arms over his chest, his expression a mixture of annoyance and disbelief. "Colonel Harrison," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded respect in the most dangerous places on earth. "I understand your position, and I respect your experience. But I've spent considerable time studying similar operations, and I believe there are some tactical considerations that haven't been adequately addressed." The colonel's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Lady, I don't know what kind of research you've been doing or what think tank you work for, but this isn't a classroom exercise. This is real-world combat planning, and it requires real-world experience that you simply don't have." Sarah felt something shift inside her, the same cold clarity that had settled over her countless times before dangerous missions. The respectful deference she had been showing evaporated, replaced by the steely confidence that had carried her through 2 decades of operations that officially never happened. "You're right about one thing, Colonel," she said, her voice dropping to the controlled tone that her former teammates would have recognized as a warning sign. "This isn't a classroom exercise, and you're also right that it requires real-world experience, but you're wrong about what kind of experience I have." The tension in the room ratcheted up another level. Several officers leaned forward in their chairs, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Colonel Harrison's face had gone from red to purple, and his hands had clenched into fists at his sides. "Mitchell, I'm going to ask you one more time to remember your place in this briefing. You are here as an observer and advisor on administrative matters. You are not here to question military strategy developed by professionals who have dedicated their lives to this work." Sarah looked around the room, taking in the faces of the officers who were watching this confrontation unfold. Some looked uncomfortable, others seemed amused by the spectacle, but all of them were clearly waiting to see how she would respond to Colonel Harrison's ultimatum. For a moment, she considered backing down. It would be easier to apologize, to take her seat and let the operation proceed as planned. She could collect her consulting fee and walk away, leaving the responsibility for success or failure to others. That was what civilians did, after all. They offered opinions and then let someone else deal with the consequences. But Sarah Mitchell had never been just a civilian, and the habits ingrained by 20 years of elite military service weren't easily suppressed. When she spoke again, her voice carried the unmistakable ring of absolute authority. "Colonel, with all due respect, I think you need to reconsider both the tactical approach and your assumptions about the people in this room. The silence that followed was deafening. Colonel Harrison's face had progressed beyond purple to something approaching crimson, and Sarah could see a vein pulsing in his temple. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely controlled. Rage. "That's it? Security, please escort Ms. Mitchell from this briefing room immediately. Her participation in this operation is terminated." As two military police officers moved towards her chair, Sarah remained perfectly still, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She looked up at Colonel Harrison with the same steady gaze she had once used to stare down enemy combatants in the mountains of Afghanistan. "Colonel," she said quietly, "before you make a decision you might regret, you might want to check with General Williams about exactly why I was invited to this briefing." For the first time since the confrontation began, uncertainty flickered across Colonel Harrison's face. General Williams outranked him by 2 levels and had a reputation for not suffering fools gladly. If she had specifically requested Sarah's presence at this briefing, there might be more to the situation than met the eye. But Colonel Harrison's pride had been publicly challenged, and he was too invested in his position to back down now. "I don't care who invited you or why. This is my operation, and I won't have civilians undermining military authority in front of my officers." Sarah nodded slowly, as if his response confirmed something she had already suspected. "I understand, Colonel, and I respect your authority over this operation. But before your security team escorts me out, would you be willing to hear what I know about the terrain where you're planning to send your soldiers?" It was a calculated risk, offering him information that might be valuable enough to overcome his wounded pride. Sarah could see him wavering, his military training warring with his personal ego. The practical side of him recognized that any intelligence about the target area could be crucial to mission success. But the prideful side wanted nothing more than to see her removed from his sight. The room held its collective breath as Colonel Harrison weighed his options. Finally, his sense of duty won out over his personal feelings, though his voice remained hostile when he spoke. "You have 2 minutes to say whatever it is you think you know. Then you're out of here." Sarah stood up and moved to the front of the room, positioning herself next to the tactical map that showed the planned operation area. As she studied the terrain features and planned routes, she could feel the weight of skeptical stares from every person in the room. These officers saw a civilian contractor who was about to waste their time with theoretical knowledge gleaned from books and satellite photos. They had no idea they were looking at someone who had once spent 3 weeks moving through those exact mountains, tracking high-value targets and coordinating with local allies in operations so classified that they would never appear in any official record. Someone who had earned her knowledge with blood and sacrifice, who had carried wounded teammates down those treacherous slopes and had memorized every ridge and valley because her life and the lives of her team had depended on it. Sarah placed her finger on the map, indicating the proposed insertion point for the rescue team. "This landing zone looks ideal from satellite imagery, but the ground truth is different. The approach slope is unstable, loose shale that will send rocks cascading down the mountain with every step. Any enemy forces in the valley will hear your team coming from over a mile away." Several officers exchanged glances, their skepticism beginning to mix with genuine interest. Sarah continued, moving her finger along the planned route. "This ridgeline that you're planning to use for Overwatch is frequently shrouded in fog during the early morning hours, which will severely limit visibility during the crucial phases of the operation. And this escape route through the northern pass is problematic because it's been used by smugglers for decades, which means it's likely booby-trapped." Colonel Harrison's expression had shifted from outright hostility to grudging attention. "How could you possibly know these details from satellite reconnaissance?" Sarah looked directly at him, and for the first time since the confrontation began, allowed a hint of her true background to show through her carefully maintained civilian facade. "Because, Colonel, I've been there." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired weapon. Colonel Harrison's eyes narrowed as he processed what Sarah had just said, while the other officers in the room shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. The casual confidence with which she had described terrain features that should have been unknown to any civilian contractor was unsettling, and it raised questions that nobody seemed prepared to ask. "What exactly do you mean you've been there?" Colonel Harrison asked, his voice tight with suspicion. Sarah glanced toward the door, where the 2 military police officers still stood waiting for orders. She knew that once she started down this path, there would be no going back to her comfortable anonymity. The carefully constructed civilian identity she had built over the past 3 years would crumble, and she would have to face all the complicated emotions and memories she'd been trying to leave behind. But the faces of 3 terrified journalists flashed through her mind, and she thought about the soldiers who would be sent into danger based on a flawed plan. Some things were more important than personal comfort. General Williams didn't tell you why she recommended me for this consultation, did she? Sarah asked. Colonel Harrison shook his head, but she could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. A colonel didn't question a general's personnel decisions without good reason, but the current situation was rapidly moving beyond normal protocol. Sarah walked back to the tactical map and placed both hands on the table, leaning forward as she studied the terrain with the focused intensity of someone reliving dangerous memories. 3 years ago, I was part of a classified operation in this exact region. We were tracking a high-value target who was believed to be coordinating attacks against coalition forces from a compound approximately here. She pointed to a location that was less than 5 kilometers from where the journalists were reportedly being held. The operation lasted 18 days, and during that time, my team and I became intimately familiar with every ridge, valley, and goat path in a 20-square-mile area. The room had gone completely silent. Even the skeptics were beginning to realize that Sarah's knowledge was far too detailed and specific to have come from academic research or satellite analysis. Colonel Harrison's face had drained of color as the implications of her words began to sink in. "What kind of operation?" he asked quietly. Sarah straightened up and looked him directly in the eyes. "The kind that doesn't appear in official records and isn't discussed in briefing rooms like this one." Colonel Harrison stared at her for a long moment, his mind racing through the possibilities. If she was telling the truth about participating in classified operations in Afghanistan, then she had to have significant military background that wasn't reflected in her current civilian status. But what kind of background would give a woman access to the kind of highly classified missions she was describing? "Who did you serve with?" he asked. "I think you know the answer to that question, Colonel. You just don't want to believe it." The words carried an unmistakable challenge, and Sarah could see the exact moment when Colonel Harrison's assumptions began to crumble. His eyes widened slightly as he processed the implications of what she was telling him, and she watched him mentally review everything he knew about elite military units and the type of operations she was describing. Major Lisa Rodriguez, one of the few female officers in the room, leaned forward in her chair. "Ma'am, are you saying you served in special operations?" "Naval Special Warfare Development Group, what most people call SEAL Team 6. The reaction in the room was immediate and dramatic. Several officers audibly gasped, others sat back in their chairs as if they had been physically struck, and Colonel Harrison's mouth fell open in genuine shock. The idea that the quiet woman they had been dismissing as an inexperienced civilian contractor was actually a veteran of the most elite military unit in the world was almost too much to process. "That's impossible," Colonel Harrison said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Women aren't allowed in the SEALs." "Officially, you're correct. The integration of female personnel into naval special warfare units remains highly classified and extremely limited. But Colonel, surely you're aware that the military has been quietly testing the boundaries of gender integration in combat roles for several years." She could see him struggling to reconcile what he was hearing with everything he thought he knew about military policy and special operations.
The cognitive dissonance was written clearly across his face, and Sarah found herself feeling almost sorry for him.
His worldview was being challenged in a very public and humiliating way, and she understood how difficult that could be for someone who had built his entire identity around military hierarchy and tradition.
"Even if what you're saying is true," Colonel Harrison said slowly, "I would need verification before I could accept your input on operational planning." Sarah reached into her briefcase and pulled out a sealed envelope that General Williams had given her before the meeting. "General Williams anticipated that you might have questions about my background. She asked me to give you this if the situation required clarification." Colonel Harrison took the envelope with trembling hands, his face pale as he broke the official seal and began reading the document inside. Sarah watched his expression change from skepticism to confusion to something approaching awe as he processed the information contained in her classified service record. The other officers in the room waited in tense silence, trying to read Colonel Harrison's reaction and understand what was happening. When he finally looked up from the document, his entire demeanor had changed. The arrogance and dismissiveness were gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine respect mixed with embarrassment. "Officers," he said in a voice that was barely above a whisper, "I need to apologize. It appears that Ms. Mitchell's qualifications for this briefing are significantly more extensive than I was led to believe." He looked directly at Sarah, his eyes reflecting a mixture of admiration and chagrin. "Master Chief Mitchell, would you be willing to share your assessment of our operational plan? The use of her former military rank sent a chill through the room and confirmed what many of the officers had already begun to suspect. Sarah felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, the same feeling she had experienced countless times before, dangerous missions, when the lives of her teammates depended on the quality of her planning and decision-making. "Thank you, Colonel. I appreciate your willingness to listen." Sarah returned to the front of the room, but this time her audience was completely different. Where before she had faced skeptical faces and dismissive attitudes, she now saw the focused attention of professional soldiers who recognized that they were receiving input from someone whose experience exceeded their own. "The fundamental problem with the current plan is that it assumes the enemy will react in predictable ways," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 2 decades making life-and-death decisions in hostile territory. "But based on my experience operating in this region, the militants who control this area are highly adaptive and extremely familiar with the terrain." She moved to the map and began outlining alternative approaches, drawing on knowledge that had been earned through months of dangerous operations in some of the most challenging terrain on Earth. As she spoke, the officers in the room took careful notes, recognizing that they were receiving a masterclass in unconventional warfare from someone who had actually lived it. "The insertion point that you've selected is too obvious," she continued. "It's exactly where any trained military planner would choose to land a helicopter, which means it's exactly where the enemy will be watching. Instead, I would recommend this location, approximately 3 kilometers to the south." She pointed to an area that looked completely unsuitable for helicopter operations, a narrow ridge surrounded by steep terrain and scattered boulders. Several officers frowned as they studied the location, clearly confused by her recommendation. "Master Chief," Major Rodriguez said, "that area doesn't appear to offer adequate space for helicopter landing." Sarah nodded approvingly at the question. "You're absolutely correct, Major. It's not suitable for traditional helicopter insertion, but it is suitable for fast roping, and more importantly, it's the last place the enemy would expect us to choose." She spent the next 30 minutes walking through a complete alternative plan, one that took into account the real-world challenges of operating in mountainous terrain against an enemy that knew the land better than any satellite imagery could reveal. Her recommendations were based on hard-earned experience with similar operations, and she could see the other officers beginning to understand why General Williams had insisted on her participation in the briefing. As she outlined the tactical approach, Sarah found herself slipping back into the mindset that had defined her military career. The careful analysis of risk and reward, the constant calculation of odds and alternatives, the absolute focus on mission success above all other considerations. It felt like putting on an old uniform that still fit perfectly, and for the first time since her retirement, she felt truly like herself again. But even as she spoke with growing confidence about terrain and tactics, part of her mind was processing the personal implications of what had just happened. Her carefully maintained civilian identity was gone, destroyed by a few minutes of honest conversation in a Pentagon briefing room. The secret she had been keeping for 3 years was now known to dozens of people, and there was no way to put that genie back in the bottle. The transition from active duty to civilian life had been the most difficult challenge of Sarah's adult life, harder than SEAL training, harder than any combat mission she had ever undertaken. The loss of purpose and identity had nearly destroyed her, and she had spent 3 years learning to define herself as something other than a warrior. Now, standing in front of a room full of military officers and feeling the familiar rush of tactical planning, she realized how much she had missed this world and how incomplete she had felt without it. Colonel Harrison had remained silent throughout her presentation, occasionally nodding as she made particularly insightful points. When she finished outlining her alternative approach, he stood up and addressed the room. "Officers, I want everyone to take careful notes as Master Chief Mitchell continues her briefing. Her recommendations will form the foundation for our revised operational plan." Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction at having her expertise finally recognized, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this moment of vindication had come at a significant personal cost. She had revealed her true identity to protect the lives of others, which was exactly what her training had taught her to do. But in doing so, she had also opened herself up to questions and scrutiny that she wasn't sure she was prepared to handle. As the briefing continued and Sarah provided detailed intelligence about enemy tactics and terrain challenges, she could feel the other officers studying her with new eyes. They were trying to reconcile the quiet civilian contractor they had initially dismissed with the highly decorated special operations veteran who was now providing critical mission planning input. Major Rodriguez approached her during a brief break in the proceedings. "Master Chief, if you don't mind me asking, what made you decide to transition to civilian life?" It was a question that Sarah had been dreading, because it forced her to confront aspects of her military service that she preferred to keep private. The official story was that she had retired after 20 years to pursue civilian opportunities, but the truth was more complicated and painful than that. Every warrior has to face the reality that their body won't last forever, Major. I reached a point where I could no longer perform at the level that my teammates deserved, so I made the difficult decision to step aside and let someone younger take my place. It was a diplomatic way of describing what had actually happened during her final mission in Syria. The operation had gone wrong in ways that still haunted her dreams, and she had made a split-second decision to shield a wounded teammate from an incoming mortar round. The explosion had shattered her left shoulder and ended her military career, but it had saved the life of a 24-year-old sailor who now had children he might never have had the chance to meet. Major Rodriguez nodded respectfully, clearly understanding that there were aspects of Sarah's story that weren't appropriate for casual conversation. Thank you for your service, Master Chief, and thank you for sharing your expertise with us today. As the briefing resumed, Sarah found herself thinking about the path that had brought her to this moment. 23 years earlier, she had been a young woman from a small town in Ohio, determined to prove that gender was no barrier to military excellence. The journey from that idealistic recruit to her current position as a respected expert in unconventional warfare had been longer and more difficult than she could have ever imagined. But standing in that Pentagon briefing room, using her hard-earned knowledge to potentially save lives, Sarah realized that every challenge she had faced and every sacrifice she had made had been leading to this moment. Her military career might have ended, but her service to her country and her fellow warriors was far from over. The revised operational plan took shape over the next 2 hours, with Sarah's recommendations fundamentally altering every aspect of the mission. Where the original plan had relied on conventional military doctrine, the new approach incorporated the kind of unconventional thinking that had made her one of the most effective operators in naval special warfare history. The transformation was remarkable, and even the most skeptical officers in the room had to acknowledge that her input had improved their chances of success dramatically. But Colonel Harrison wasn't finished testing her credentials. As the formal briefing concluded and most of the officers began filing out of the room, he approached Sarah with the expression that mixed respect with lingering doubt. "Master Chief Mitchell," he said quietly, "I want to apologize for my earlier behavior. Your expertise is clearly valuable, and I should have shown more professional courtesy regardless of your apparent civilian status." Sarah nodded graciously. "Thank you, Colonel. I understand that the situation was confusing, and I don't hold your initial reaction against you." Colonel Harrison glanced around the room to ensure they had relative privacy before continuing. "However, I hope you'll understand that I need to verify some of the specific intelligence you've provided. The details you've shared about terrain and enemy tactics are extremely specific, and if we're going to base our operation on that information, I need to be absolutely certain of its accuracy." Sarah had expected this moment. Military officers didn't survive in their positions by accepting unverified intelligence, no matter how credible the source appeared to be. Colonel Harrison was doing exactly what any responsible commander should do under the circumstances. "What kind of verification do you need?" she asked. "I'd like you to speak with someone who can confirm your knowledge of the operational area. General Williams is arranging a secure video conference with Lieutenant Commander James Torres, who led several operations in that region during the same time period you mentioned." She knew him well, perhaps better than she wanted to admit. He had been her team leader during some of the most dangerous missions of her career, and their professional relationship had evolved into something more personal before her injury and retirement had complicated everything. They hadn't spoken since her farewell ceremony 3 years earlier, and she wasn't sure how she felt about the prospect of seeing him again under these circumstances. "When is this conference scheduled?" she asked, hoping her voice sounded more casual than she felt. "In about 20 minutes. Will that be a problem?" Sarah shook her head, though internally she was bracing herself for what promised to be a difficult conversation. Torres knew her better than almost anyone else in the military, which meant he would be able to verify her credentials without question. But it also meant he would be able to see through any emotional defenses she might try to maintain during their conversation. The secure communications room was located 2 floors below the briefing room, accessed through multiple security checkpoints and guarded by personnel with the kind of serious expressions that discouraged casual conversation. Sarah followed Colonel Harrison through the maze of corridors, her mind racing through memories of her partnership with Torres, and wondering how much he had changed in the 3 years since her retirement. The video conference screen flickered to life, revealing a familiar face that looked older and more weathered than Sarah remembered. Lieutenant Commander Torres was calling from a forward operating base somewhere in the Middle East, his desert camouflage uniform dusty, and his dark eyes carrying the kind of fatigue that came from months of continuous operations. Colonel Harrison, Torres said, his voice crackling slightly through the encrypted connection. I understand you have some questions about operational intelligence. That's correct, Commander. I have someone here who claims to have extensive knowledge of the mountainous region near Kandahar, specifically the area around grid coordinates 31.6086 north, 66.0361 east. She says she operated there approximately 3 years ago as part of a classified mission. Torres's expression changed subtly as he processed the information, his eyes sharpening with recognition. Colonel, can you tell me who this individual is? Colonel, Harrison gestured for Sarah to move into the camera's field of view. This is Sarah Mitchell, currently working as a civilian contractor, but claiming prior service with Naval Special Warfare Development Group. The effect on Torres was immediate and dramatic. His composed military bearing cracked for just a moment, revealing genuine surprise and something that might have been joy before he recovered his professional demeanor. Sarah, he said softly, and there was a wealth of history in the way he spoke her name. I wasn't expecting to see you again so soon. Sarah stepped closer to the camera, acutely aware that Colonel Harrison was studying both their reactions, with the keen attention of someone trying to piece together a puzzle. Hello, James. I hope you're staying safe over there. Torres smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth she had seen from him since the call began. You know me, Sarah. I'm too stubborn to let anything happen to me out here. His expression grew more serious as he addressed Colonel Harrison. Colonel, I can confirm that Master Chief Mitchell served with distinction in our unit and participated in multiple classified operations in the area you mentioned. Her knowledge of that terrain and the enemy tactics in that region is unquestionable. Can you provide specifics? Colonel Harrison asked. Torres glanced at Sarah, and she could see him making rapid calculations about how much classified information he could safely reveal over an encrypted but not entirely secure video link. Without going into operational details that remain classified, I can tell you that Master Chief Mitchell was one of our most effective operators in that theater. She has first-hand knowledge of enemy tactics, terrain challenges, and local political dynamics that would be invaluable for any operation in that area. Colonel Harrison nodded slowly, clearly satisfied with the verification. Thank you, Commander. That's exactly what I needed to hear. But Torres wasn't finished. Colonel, if I may ask, what kind of operation are you planning in that region? Hostage rescue. 3 American journalists captured by militants operating out of the mountain caves. Torres' expression grew grim. That's a challenging operational environment, Colonel. The terrain is unforgiving, and the enemy knows it better than we do. You'll need someone with extensive experience in unconventional warfare and mountain operations to have any chance of success. We have Master Chief Mitchell providing consultation on the tactical plan. Good, Torres said emphatically. She's exactly the right person for that job. Colonel, I've served with a lot of exceptional operators over the years, but Master Chief Mitchell was in a class by herself. If she's telling you something about that operational area, you should listen to her. Sarah felt a flush of warmth at his praise, but also a pang of sadness at the reminder of what she had lost when her military career ended. The confidence and sense of purpose that had once defined her felt like distant memories, replaced by the uncertainty and disconnection that had characterized her civilian life. Master Chief, Torres continued, looking directly into the camera, are you planning to participate directly in this operation? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah knew what he was really asking. Despite her injury and retirement, was she prepared to return to active operations if the situation required it? It was a question she had been avoiding for 3 years, but now it demanded an answer. I'm providing consultation and tactical planning only, she replied carefully. My active duty days are behind me. Torres studied her face intently, and she could see that he wasn't entirely convinced by her answer. He knew her well enough to recognize the signs that she was wrestling with deeper questions about her identity and purpose. Colonel Harrison, Torres said, I need to speak with Master Chief Mitchell privately for a few minutes if that's acceptable. Colonel Harrison glanced between them, clearly sensing the personal undercurrents in their conversation. I'll wait outside. Take all the time you need. After the colonel left the room, Torres leaned closer to his camera, his expression becoming more intimate and concerned. Sarah, how are you really doing? It was such a simple question, but it cut through all of her carefully constructed defenses and forced her to confront emotions she had been suppressing for years. The tears came without warning, and she found herself crying in front of a man she had once trusted with her life but hadn't spoken to since the day her career ended. I'm struggling, James, she admitted through her tears. I don't know who I am anymore without the mission and the team. Everything that gave my life meaning is gone, and I don't know how to rebuild from nothing. Torres's face softened with genuine compassion. Sarah, you were the strongest person I ever served with. You saved my life more times than I can count, and you made every mission better by being part of it. That strength didn't disappear when you retired. It's still there, even if you can't feel it right now. But what am I supposed to do with it? I can't go back to active duty, and civilian life feels like sleepwalking compared to what we used to do. Maybe you don't have to choose between military and civilian life, Torres suggested. Maybe there's a third option that combines your experience with your desire to keep serving well. Sarah wiped her eyes and looked at him questioningly. What do you mean? I mean that the military needs people like you in consulting and training roles. Your knowledge and experience are too valuable to waste in some corporate office. There are dozens of operations every year that could benefit from your expertise, and hundreds of young operators who could learn from your experience. It was an idea that Sarah had considered before but never seriously pursued. The prospect of remaining connected to the military world without the physical demands of active operations was appealing, but she had always dismissed it as a compromise that wouldn't satisfy her need for meaningful work. Do you really think I could make a difference in that kind of role? She asked. Sarah, look what you've accomplished today. You walked into a briefing room full of skeptical officers and completely transformed their operational plan. You potentially saved the lives of 3 hostages and the soldiers who will be sent to rescue them. If that's not making a difference, I don't know what is. Torres was right, and Sarah could feel something shifting in her perspective. For 3 years, she had been mourning the loss of her military identity, instead of recognizing how that experience could be channeled into new forms of service. The skills she had developed over 2 decades didn't have to disappear just because she could no longer carry a rifle into combat. James, there's something I need to ask you, she said, her voice becoming more serious. If this rescue operation goes forward with the plan I've recommended, what are the chances of success? Torres considered the question carefully. Based on what I know about that terrain and enemy capabilities, I'd say the chances improve significantly with your recommendations. But Sarah, mountain operations are always high risk, especially hostage rescues. Even with the best planning, there are no guarantees. And if they used the original plan instead of mine?
Honestly?
I think they'd be walking into a disaster. The approach they were considering would have gotten a lot of good soldiers killed and probably wouldn't have saved the hostages. Sarah nodded grimly. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed by someone with Torres's experience made the stakes even clearer. The responsibility she felt for the success of the operation was enormous, and she realized that her involvement couldn't end with the briefing room consultation. James, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Always. Do you think I'm capable of returning to field operations, even in a limited capacity? The question surprised him, and she could see him processing the implications of what she was asking. Sarah, your shoulder injury was serious. Are you saying you've recovered enough to consider active participation? I'm saying that 3 American lives are hanging in the balance, and I might be the person best qualified to help save them. My personal limitations seem less important than their survival. Torres stared at her through the camera for a long moment, and she could see him weighing his response carefully. He knew her well enough to recognize the determination in her voice, but he also knew the extent of her injuries and the risks involved in returning to active operations before she was fully recovered. Sarah, if you're seriously considering field participation, you need to be evaluated by medical personnel who understand the physical demands of special operations. I can't make that determination over a video call. But if I passed a medical evaluation, would you support my participation in this operation? In a heartbeat, he replied without hesitation. But only if you're completely honest about your capabilities and limitations. The team's safety depends on everyone being able to perform their assigned roles without compromise. Sarah felt a surge of determination that she hadn't experienced since her final mission 3 years earlier. The prospect of returning to active operations was terrifying, but it was also exhilarating in a way that nothing in her civilian life had been. For the first time since her retirement, she felt like she might have found her way back to the purpose and meaning that had always driven her. Thank you, James. That means more to me than you know. Sarah, whatever you decide to do, remember that you have nothing left to prove to anyone. You've already done more than your share of dangerous missions. If you choose to stay in a consulting role, that's a completely honorable decision. And if I choose to gear up one more time? Torres smiled, and she could see the same excitement in his eyes that she felt in her own heart. Then I'd say the hostages just got very lucky, and the enemy is about to face someone they're not prepared to handle. The conversation ended a few minutes later, but Sarah remained in the secure communications room for several more minutes, processing everything that had happened and trying to understand the fundamental shift that had occurred in her thinking. When she finally emerged to rejoin Colonel Harrison, she was no longer the uncertain civilian contractor who had entered the Pentagon that morning. She was Master Chief Sarah Mitchell again, and she had decisions to make about her future and the lives that depended on her choices. Colonel Harrison took one look at her face and knew that something significant had changed. "Master Chief, are you ready to discuss the next phase of operational planning?"
Sarah straightened her shoulders and looked him directly in the eyes.
"Colonel, I'd like to request permission to participate in this operation in a more direct capacity." The words surprised even her as she spoke them, but they felt absolutely right. For 3 years, she had been trying to figure out how to live without the sense of purpose that had defined her adult life. Now she realized that the answer wasn't learning to live without it, but rather finding new ways to embrace it. Colonel Harrison's eyes widened. "Master Chief, are you suggesting active field participation?" "That's exactly what I'm suggesting, Colonel. Those hostages need the best possible chance of survival, and I believe I can contribute to that outcome." As she stood in that Pentagon corridor, surrounded by the controlled chaos of military planning and preparation, Sarah Mitchell felt truly alive for the first time in 3 years. The journey back to herself had been longer and more difficult than any mission she had ever undertaken, but she was finally ready to embrace both her past and her future. The woman who had walked into the briefing room that morning as an uncertain civilian contractor was gone forever. In her place stood a warrior who had rediscovered her purpose and was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. "Stay put," the colonel shouted at her, not knowing she had 20 years as a SEAL.